Right, everybody, I think it's time to kick off. It's a couple of minutes past 3 o'clock here in London. Welcome to the Oasis Open Data Standards webinar. We've got an exciting lineup of speakers for you this afternoon, all the way through from representatives from Oasis to brokers, insurers, reinsurers, model practitioners who are actively using the open data standards that have been created. This afternoon, I wanted to kick off just to explain a little bit about the campaign that we've got for open data standards. Today is really just a kick-off meeting, but throughout the autumn, there'll be a whole series of opinion articles, blogs, even videos talking a little bit more about how you can contribute to open data standards. On this slide, I've just borrowed from our friends at Icebreaker One, a slide which just shows a little bit about what is open data. And we see three different types being open data, open licenses with low friction, all the way through to shared data and closed data. There's nothing wrong with closed data. It just implies perhaps a one-to-one bilateral arrangement. But the advantage of shared data allows us to scale the work that we're doing. And currently, Oasis Loss Modeling Framework is curating the standards for catastrophe modeling around this ODS that Matt and others will come into in more detail later on this afternoon. A good example of open standards was set by the open banking industry. As you know, these days, it's much easier for us to be able to switch bank accounts, and that's all come through the open banking standards, which essentially has mandated how data could be shared between banks. Now, clearly, you don't want your bank statement shared with anyone down the street, but if you've got the opportunity of seeing what's out there in terms of different products, it's much easier for the customer to be served. And that's the same principle that we're looking for with open data standards, which allows for greater transparency and improved interoperability. And again, our speakers will be talking about that this afternoon. What I'd like to show now is the agenda that we've got for this afternoon. In a few minutes, Dickie will be talking about the importance of data standards, and Matt will be talking much more about the background to how ODS has come into being, a bit about the governments, a bit about OED, Open Exposure Database, and the next steps as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce each section as we go through. It's time for Dickie to say a few words. Dickie and I have known each other for a few years. It says on this crib sheet that he's been in the industry for 30 years, but I know that that's not true because it was many more years ago than that Dickie was the very first broker that I wrote a piece of business to. I hold nothing against that, Dickie, but now over to you. Let's hear what you have to say in terms of the importance of data standards and the why.
Jeremy, very kind. Thank you very much for hosting the event today and indeed for chairing the steering group, which you do so professionally. So I think I just want to say a little few words about sort of why this is really important, some of which should be fairly obvious, but I find in my journey around the world, often people sometimes miss some aspects of this. So you've set up well, Jeremy, the value overall of open data and the need for standards. And you gave a good example about the open data standards that a mutual friend of ours helped create. Essentially, the problem we have in the insurance industry is that the standards that we've been using over the years essentially aren't open. And what most industries have done to solve that problem is they've created open standards that are owned by the industry. I think probably the best example would be the SWIFT standards that again, the banking industry hold. So those are the ones that allow for messaging standards to operate for all financial transactions around the world. And that's been going since about 1970s, I think. So we've been a bit behind, and some of you will have been involved in some initiatives before. And I occasionally get asked questions about, so why is this any different from the Cresta Plus, which I know a few of us can remember if you go back long enough time? Well, I think the answer is there are a couple of reasons why this is different. I think one of them is there is such a driving imperative today to improve costs. And actually the inefficiency we have by having too many standards and too many standards that are open, ultimately one of the things it does is leads to an increase in cost. So the cost driver, I think, is a really important one today. And that perhaps has led to a number of organizations around the world who really have started driving this. And you're going to hear from some of them today, and we've got some lined up for a webinar in a few weeks' time too. And I think really interestingly and luckily quite timely for us, there's an organization that was set up in the States that called itself CMOS, or Catastrophe Modeling Operating System, done under the auspices of a non-profit organization called the Institute. And it reviewed the position around data standards in insurance. And it started, in fact, just almost a year ago now, with a meeting in New York. And their report, or initial report, came out a few days ago. And in that report, and it's you'll get a chance to read it over the next few days. But I think the highlight for me was we have to pick a standard that makes sense. And the open data standards that we are looking after on behalf of the community are an extremely good starting point. And like all of these things, to make them work, we need to get behind it. And I think that's the only thing that essentially is now missing from the sort of efficiency and the interoperability we can get and all the benefits we can get from these standards, is actually to get everybody behind it. So the purpose of today is the beginning of a journey on our attempt to convey to you exactly, hopefully, why it becomes a little bit more important. You'll have other people talking about it too, but we're all going to talk about a little bit more about the what, and we're going to continue doing that. And I think, and I'm sure Jeremy might mention this later, but while I think about it, what's extremely important from all of you is we'd love to hear from you about what you think you need to be able to adopt these standards going forward. We'll probably come back to it. It'll probably be said more than once, but hopefully at least that way we'll get that message across. So I think before handing over Matt, I just want to leave you with this thought that we have to own these standards, and therefore us curating them creates that environment. A lot of work's already gone in. They are good to be able to use now. They need to become better. They will become better with your engagement, and we encourage you to begin that process now. And so with that, I think enough from me. Back to you, Jeremy, and you can sort of pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Dickie. Great introduction. Thank you very much. And next we have Matt Donovan, who's the program manager at Oasis. He's got a background in exposure management with experience in risk modeling and portfolio roll-up. Matt, would you like to tell us a bit more about the background, the what?
Hi there, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for that, Jeremy. I'll just share my screen with you all. And yeah, so I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going through the what part of ODS and an overview of ODS and specifically OED. Now, I appreciate that some of this material is familiar to you guys on the call that have started using OED or certainly know a bit more about ODS than others, but I'm hoping that it will still be beneficial and bring some information. So if I just move along to the next slide, which I don't know how you do. Okay, there we go, sorry. So like Dickie and Jeremy sort of said, this is an open, transparent modeling data standard that is developed and governed by the market for the market. Now, you've just heard Dickie say it, but it's a key message that we need to reiterate just through this webinar and also this campaign, is that this is not an Oasis standard. We are just curating it at the moment. It is a standard for the market and needs to be developed further in collaboration with the market. So it's not an Oasis standard. So it is model agnostic, designed to help solve interoperability problems in the market, which therefore improves efficiency and transparency across CAT modeling. And this is especially important when it comes to data transfer of analytics, certainly across vendors and different models. So it is governed by a steering committee, which I'll discuss in a minute. And that's made up of attendees from various CAT modeling companies, insurers, reinsurers, brokers, and technology companies. And so at the moment, ODS encompasses both OED, which is your open exposure data, and your ORD, which is open results. But it shouldn't just be limited to that. So Dickie sort of mentioned it briefly earlier, that it's a standard that can encompass many things. So whether we start looking at things like interoperability standards and messaging standards and things like contract definition language and things like that. So the ODS at the moment is just focused on exposure and will be results data, but this is something that can really develop quite a lot. So it's all the information around governance, versioning, updates are all managed on a GitHub repository, which is completely open and accessible to anyone. The link is there. So we will, we do encourage everyone just to go and have a look at that, and there's a lot more information on it, and you can then submit feedback and some ideas of how or where you might want to get involved. So just a bit on the steering committee. So here's a list of probably some quite familiar companies to a lot of you that are represented at the steering committee. So at the moment we're meeting 3 or 4 times a year, is chaired by Oasis, and we're using, like I said, we're using the GitHub repository as the management system of this. So we're using the semantics and the formats of GitHub to control and communicate the major and minor updates and the patches. Any day-to-day implementations or issues or updates or suggestions that come in are raised through issues on the repository. And there's a sort of day-to-day maintenance group of a few of us that sort of get together and talk about these small updates. Anything more substantial and significant will then be filtered up through the steering committee, where further review and discussion will be had. But generally on day-to-day stuff, the implementations at the moment to date are quite small. So one of the next things the steering committee are working on are sub-working groups to focus on specific projects to take the data standards forward. So the next big one we're looking at is technology and things like expanding line of business and just the general scope of data standards, which again, I'll talk a little bit about towards the end. So just a bit on the history. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So back in 2017, it was decided that there was a need for a dedicated Oasis input format for Oasis-based models. So at the beginning of 2017, a working group from Simplitium, which is now NASDAQ, that was led by Matthew Jones and Eyster Kalanaskaita, got together with us at Oasis and Ascot and Canopius and formed a core working group to start talking about what needs to happen, what are the first steps. 6 months later, that was then expanded to a wider group, and you can see the participants there, some of the big brokers and a couple of some big reinsurers, and also a couple of cat model vendors there sort of got together and formed a larger, wider working group. And OED was then released on GitHub and maintained by Simplitium towards the end of that year. And so just moving on to the latter part of last year, so ORD was developed as a product of the Lloyd's Lab Cohort 3 project, which Oasis took part in. And I'll talk a bit about ORD in a second. And then moving on to this year, so from February this year, just before lockdown, the steering committee was set up and we had the first meeting. And then during lockdown, Oasis actually migrated over the OED repository from Simplitium, or from NASDAQ, which is now curated through Oasis. So just a bit on ORD. So open results data, like I said, it was the product of the Lloyd's Lab from last year. And it's something that, it's in line with OED in regards to having consistent open data formats, but from the output side, from the results, the model results side. So we're looking at extensive output reports, which are completely customizable by the user, all consistent and agnostic across all vendors and models. And this is something that is sort of high on the agenda. I'd say probably the highest on the agenda for next year for development. So the ORD will be developed into the Oasis platform. And like I said, we're going to have some technology working groups and some participants to sort of get together and start working on the ORD. So I'll move on to OED now, just because this is much further along. It's been used for the last couple of years by some people in the market, some which you'll hear talk after me. But when Matt and I started working on this a couple of years ago, it was developed in close collaboration with AIR, who opened up their seed database. for Matt and ISTA to work closely with. And the whole idea around it was flexibility to accommodate multiple model vendors and developer requirements and multiple users generally. So in the early days of the development, there was a lot of market input. And so the idea was that it needed to support quite an extensive scope of limits, deductible combinations, special conditions from coverage levels upwards, just to accommodate the wide user audience. And it supports a comprehensive step policy functionality. And it's also worth noting that at the moment, OED can support a much larger scope of data that is currently available in Oasis models to accommodate any future developments. So at the moment, the Oasis models, well, the Oasis financial model is continuously developing to expand the OED functionality it can support all the time. So the OED can actually cater for a lot more than the Oasis can at the moment for the FM. So OED for input CSV files. So for those of you on the call that frequently use CAT modeling software and have done in recent years, or certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, you're familiar with input file formats, and this is very similar to what the formats to what you would be used to. So and all reinsurance details are captured in those input files with nothing to apply post import. So here's a list of some model vendors. Again, to a lot of you, these will be quite familiar. And these are all of the companies and all of the model vendors that currently have models on the Oasis platform and that use and support the OED as their exposure data input format. There's some quite big model vendors there. And just a bit on the actual details. So, you know, again, from a CAT modeling use perspective, the location file, this is the only compulsory file to use for modeling on the Oasis platform to produce your ground up or economic losses. This is the only file you'll need for those losses. As you'd expect, it contains all of your address information, primary and secondary modifiers, coverage TIVs, and any location level deductibles and limits. And as I've mentioned previously, it's got a large number of fields to cover the extensive scope of those limits and deductibles by individual coverage. And I've listed some of the limits and deductibles it can support there. And it's also worth noting that it has a lock group field, so the user can group or link specific locations if they want to model something like a university campus or an industrial site. And again, account file, a lot of field headers here, you know, to support all of those combinations at the policy and account level. It's got it's the ability to isolate and apply, again, a lot of special conditions to locations within a policy or an account. There's a lot of fields in there, 20+ fields in there to accommodate any step policy options, and includes multiple triggers and payouts. And again, like the lock file, there's an @group field, which the user can then group or link accounts for reporting or binder purposes. And then just onto the two reinsurance files. Now, both of these are required in the model on the Oasis platform to model any reinsurance structures. So the first one, your reinsurance info, and this essentially contains all of your reinsurance contract information, and it supports all of the key and the core reinsurance structures that you'd expect, which are listed there. And here's where you have all of your layer information, your per risk attachment point, occurrence limits, and new in priority, all of those sort of things. And then finally, the fourth file is our reinsurance scope file that accompanies the info file. And this has all of the information of the exposure where the reinsurance needs to be applied. So this is where the user would include their portfolios and their account numbers, policy and lock numbers and things like that, just so the model knows which exposures the reinsurance is being applied to. And also you'd have any risk level definitions in there and any ceded percentages if you're modeling a surplus share. And so just a bit on flexibility now. So like I said, the key for OED is to be flexible to cater for a large number of users. So what we use is we use multiple rows at the moment for the same policy and account, again, just to cater for those complex financial structures. And these can then apply to the different coverages, locations, and also perils. So the perils in OED are actually represented by a 3-digit code. So this enables greater flexibility in stating what perils any financial or policy term should be applied to, whether you want to isolate or exclude any peril. We also have flexi tables in there. Again, this is able to the user to enter any additional fields or store data where at the moment there isn't an OED field available. So one example here, we've got a flexi lock ZZZ header, and you can just replace the ZZZ with your data. So this is a location house color, for example, just for this. And just finally, again, with flexibility, one of the good things is it's able to accommodate the different model developer requirements when it comes to geographical fields. So there's 5 pairs of fields in their jog scheme 1 to 5 and jog name 1 to 5. Again, so this allows the developer to define their own geographical scheme using a code. So the example we've got here is that if a developer wanted to split up a country into 4 regions, A, B, C, and D, let's say, you give it a code. So I've called it quad, for example, and then you would just simply enter A, B, C, or D in your geography name field. You're also able to specify your own scheme if you just start with an X, and that then avoids any potential clash with any future model developer schemes. So it really is quite flexible in accommodating those different schemes that are specific to different models or vendors or developers. And again, going back, all on GitHub, all of this information when it comes to coding financial structures, occupancy, construction types, peril codes, financial codes, they're all on GitHub and in the open exposure data specification document, which is housed on the repo. Just a bit on the structure of field names. So like I said, there's hundreds of field headers for each and all the different combinations of financial terms. And the way those field names are structured is they're sort of split into 4 main areas. So the first one would be your hierarchy, your policy account location. The second part would determine whether it's a deductible, a limit, a max or min deductible. The third part is then a code that we use, a 1-digit code, which basically tells whether it's a percentage of loss or a percentage of TIV, deductible or limit. And then the final part of that would be your coverage. Is it being applied to buildings, contents, BI? So it just gives you an idea on what those column headers mean, and all this information again is available. And just finally, just for the last minute or so before I hand back to Jeremy, so data standards. So what's on the horizon and the next steps? So like I mentioned previously before, and also after Dickie, is that this is, although it's been going a couple of years, certainly OED, it's very much at the early stages of its development. There is a lot of scope, a lot of development needed, and through collaboration with the market. And I think one of the obvious routes to go down for next steps is expanding the lines of business and moving the focus away solely from property cat, but the most obvious ones to mind are marine, cyber, liability, and seeing how open data standards can start catering for more and more lines of business. Technology, that's also it's also quite high up on the list as well. So I haven't mentioned it, but I haven't included it in this, but OED does actually have a SQL schema. This is something Matt and Eyster developed on the early days of OED, and the reason is simply the market, cat modeling market, knows SQL. We've been using it for years, and it's familiar to us. I mean, the problem is that we all know it has a lot of limitations. It's not very extensible. It's not proprietary. It's proprietary, sorry, to Microsoft. So it's not a technology that we recommend or we would like to continue supporting or maintaining. So we are starting to look at the technology options going forward. So looking at a JSON schema, potentially Parquet is another format that's come to discussions. And these formats and these technologies need to be hierarchical and extensible, and essentially efficient in the way that we're not repeating ourselves. And also going back to including things like complex language for contracts and CDL. And we also need to start thinking about how these are packaged and how they're hosted. So that's all I sort of wanted to talk about. I understand I've gone through it pretty quickly in 15 minutes and thrown all this information to you. But like I said, it's all on GitHub. It's all there. And just to repeat what Dickie said, it is very much a market initiative and a collaboration. And this is just the sort of start of the journey without it sounding too cheesy. And we're going to have a lot more material and information going out to the market in the next 3 to 6 months for this campaign. So thanks for listening. I appreciate your time. And on that, I'll hand back to Jeremy.
Matt, well done. Nice presentation, and also a nice trip down memory lane for those of us who have been involved in the process over the last 18 months or so, and cracking work in terms of what you've been up to this year. So our next section, we have two speakers, and Stuart, if you want to start getting ready to present your couple of slides, we're going to be talking about the how, which is talking about getting data into the OED format. And first up is Stuart. Stuart Fraser is an independent disaster risk and catastrophe analytics consultant. And he's been working in the development and insurance sectors on assessment and communication of disaster risk for multiple hazards. Research experience is on tsunami hazard and risk modeling, and he has a PhD in emergency management. Stuart, look forward to hearing what you have to say about the Insurance Development Forum Interoperability Working Group.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just take 5 minutes or so just to describe what we've been doing in the IDF Risk Modelling Steering Group on interoperability. So a couple of years ago, we set up an interoperability work stream to look at how we could help increase the efficiency of moving data around the market, recognizing that lots of resources put into transforming data between the different formats used by the vendor models. So we set this working group up, the ITWG, and that now comprises over 35 different firms from around the market. And we set about creating or focusing on creating an exposure data transformation framework. So the aim of this was to be an open source, industry owned and managed transformation framework, specifically focusing on property cat data in the first instance. And we had lots of consultations within the working group about which format we should use and how we might formulate a transformation tool. We came down on the decision to use OED as the central, if you like, format for this transformation tool, and created a structure in which we would provide data mappings from multiple vendor models into and out of OED. In doing so, people can move data from, say, seed to OED and back again. And once it's in OED format, onto multiple other models. And the idea would be that this is industry owned and managed, as I say, pooling people's resources to develop and then maintain this transformation tool. Recognizing that every time a model is updated and the exposure data schema changes, then multiple companies and people within those companies are having to change their data transformation practices, whether it's a Python script, a SQL script, or something larger, like broking houses have developed, like Impact Workbench and so on. The idea of making this open and open source was to enable firms with fewer resources who maybe don't license the big broker transformation tools and rely on a series of, let's say, bespoke scripts to transfer data or manual transfer of data to actually access this and work more efficiently. Another aspect of this transformation would be that we can provide mapping files, and within those we can provide the assumptions and the transformations that have been applied to data. So that includes the mapping of one field to another, or how a value has been adjusted in converting from one model to another. We can provide those assumptions transparently. So we can provide the files that are used in this transformation with the exposure data to a broker, to an analyst, a counterpart in another firm, so that those mapping files and the assumptions can be understood in a straightforward manner. We talked about also through this collaboratively developing a default transformation. So together as an industry, or certainly as a working group representing large portion of the industry, there would be a default mapping that almost accepts the default standard mapping between SEED and OED and OED and the other models. Where there's no, or where there's good agreement that one field maps to another in two different models, that could be considered the default. But the transformation was always designed such that if a certain project, a certain contract or firm needed to apply something different to the default, so representing, let's say, greenhouses with another construction type other than the default, that could also be written into the transformation and communicated transparently through this system. So the framework was also designed to be model agnostic and extensible. So we focused, as I said, on property cat while developing this this proof of concept, but we needed this framework to provide as little friction as possible when developing mappings between the various models that are available. So we've tried to develop this in a as model agnostic structure as possible. So to date, the working group has been focusing on this for the last 2 years. We've done 2 rounds of development, and we now have a Python package for a transformation tool available on GitHub. It is limited to property cat, as we said, but it's focused on limited account and location information. So primary modifiers, a limited amount of financial terms. The aim so far has been to get the framework in place in a model agnostic format, tested to a certain degree, and then we can start building out the mapping files to account for more attributes, for more mappings between more models, and then we can look to extend lines of business, as Matt was talking about, around OED. But it's a much younger and less developed initiative. But as Dickie mentioned, interoperability and needing to get behind the open data standards, this type of tool can facilitate, hopefully, people getting behind those standards, as it facilitates people getting data into them more easily. So a bit more about the details of the framework. So it's fairly straightforward. We have a mapping file in human readable YAML format, and that's shown on the right-hand side here. So each mapping file would be defined for an input format and an output format. Here, AAR location would be the input, and the output would be OED location file. And it defines the types in let's say the first half of that file. It defines the value type for each field, and below that, where you see line 45 and account number, it says transformation, and in OED that gets translated. The value gets translated as it is in the seed file into the field contract ID. You can also have transformations where you replace the field value or do mathematical operations on a field value. So the bottom block there demonstrates this for the construction code. So the first value there, 100, 101, is their AAR construction code translating to the equivalent OED construction code. So this YAML file, the mapping file, was defined specifically for this framework to allow people to read the transformation, the value and field mapping that is being performed, but also to be able to edit it very, very easily. And we have this mapping file that provides a mapping from AAR to OED, and the framework actually uses the same mapping file in reverse. So you can run the transformation using the same mapping file, and it will go from OED to AAR. And we think this helps with maintaining mapping, reducing the number of mapping files that people are producing, while providing the forward and backward transformation capability. So back to the structure, there's a configuration file which is shown in the black background and grey text, where you define your input format, your output format. You define the type of data runner, and there are 3 different types of data runners available to process the data through this transformation, each of them running in Python, and provides an option to define your export files and your import files. So the transformation itself requires flat file input formats. The extractor in that diagram takes the flat file, translates it into Python dictionaries, which is then run through the runner, and that goes into the loader, which does the reverse. It translates values from Python dictionaries into the flat file of your output. So it would provide you, in this case, the OED format. So hopefully just that quick example of the mapping file shows you how the transformation information would be shared with the exposure data that one analyst would be sharing with another, and demonstrates how easy that would be to understand and to change and communicate changes to the default. Now, all the code is openly available on GitHub, the URL on the bottom corner there, and there's some limited documentation on a GitHub Pages site accompanying that. Now, we completed the second phase of development in August. We're currently at the stage of establishing a steering group for this framework to take it forward, and that steering group would define the priorities for next development. It would work with members of the interoperability working group, specifically model providers, to develop new mappings. I feel that that's the key next step, to develop new mappings to bring people into contact with this framework and enable more people to use it, because obviously at the moment it's limited to people using SEED and OED. And we need to continue testing not only the framework, but the capabilities of the mapping file to be extended and to handle different attributes and different models. So it's going to be quite an open development process. We'll run that as the OED through GitHub. We're going to have a steering group controlling or informing the direction of the development of this framework, and a technical group drawn from the ITWG to continue review and pushing the technical side of this framework. So as I said, we're at the stage of defining that steering group at the moment, and we'll be pushing that forward in the next 6 months, and we'll be communicating progress really through the ITWG, but hopefully through the open data standards workshops and steering group too. So we'll be staying connected with the open data standards, and any changes with OED obviously need to be replicated within the mapping file to it. So there's some intrinsic link there that on the technical level that needs to continue. So I'll stop there and pass back to Jeremy.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed. Great presentation, very interesting. Before I pass on to Tej, I just wanted to remind everybody, a few people had joined after the opening slide, that you do have opportunities here to ask questions. Use the chat facility, look for the questions name, and please pose your question. Hopefully you'll have time at the end of this webinar to answer some of those questions, but don't worry, any questions that you have posed, firstly, will be asked anonymously, and secondly, we'll probably push some of the answers to your questions out in part of our communication process over the coming weeks. So I'd like now pleased to introduce Tej Sreenath, who is a senior catastrophe analyst working with Aon. He's been with Aon since 2015 and works on various technical aspects of exposure data, research and development of the Impact Workbench application. He's based in Bangalore and has a Master's of Technology from the esteemed Jain University in India. So Tej, if you wouldn't mind, would you like to give us your demo of the Impact Workbench?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. Share my screen. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'll be presenting Impact Workbench and how we can convert exposures from various vendor CAT models or raw data to OED file format, OED accepted file format. Before we go in detail on Impact Workbench, I just want to spend some time on what Aon is doing with respect to open catastrophe modeling. Aon's product, Impact Forecasting, Elements, and Impact Workbench support open catastrophe modeling. Impact Forecasting has released its models, for example, the European windstorm model, Malaysian flood, to name a few, in the Oasis-based systems. It also supports the Oasis hazard and vulnerability formats and OED format. On the exposure translation, Aon's product Impact Workbench now supports OED conversion, wherein we can convert our exposures from a source CAT model or a raw data to OED format. Going in detail on Impact Workbench, what exactly Impact Workbench is and what are the benefits of Impact Workbench. Impact Workbench is a software that helps to transform the complex exposure data source from a source CAT model to the target CAT model. And the processes within Impact Workbench are all template driven, and it is customizable. We have got standard templates for each and every processes within Impact Workbench, but it is customizable so that the software adapts to the system of the user. So users can create their own templates in every processes within the application. The Impact Workbench, the benefits of using Impact Workbench is it allows project continuity. It is auditable. Every click within the app is auditable. It helps in repeatability and also improves efficiency by reducing human errors. We also provide API that can be linked with a third-party tool within the organization for further enhancement of the entire process, on automating the entire processes. Speaking more in detail on the processes within Impact Workbench, there are four main processes in Impact Workbench. That is, firstly, it is we import data. We import data as a raw data. We can import raw data .csv file or Excel file or even a SQL database into the application. Or we import AER seed portfolios or Classic 2 portfolios and even other formats. So once the data is imported into Impact Workbench, that is the impact, the data comes into the Impact Workbench schema, the very first stage is we have defined a few library of scripts to check the quality of the data, wherein users can check the quality of the data on the exposure data. If there are any data entry issues, they can identify the irregularities in the very first stage and then proceed with the modeling. The third stage is the most important stage where we actually transform the data. That is where we map our primary characteristics, secondary characteristics such as occupancy, construction, secondary modifiers, address informations, and also the financial terms. And the last is we export data into multiple, we can export data into OED format or any other CAT model format. Over to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tej. A very slick presentation, and it's a very useful tool as well. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that. So now we're getting to the third part of our presentations this afternoon. Dr. Sibylle Steimen, she is the Managing Director of Advisory and Services at Allianz and has had various roles over the last 15 years Manjit Allianz Re. We're extremely privileged and pleased that one of our members of the board can come and speak to us this afternoon. So Sibylle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everybody from my side. So I think we can just jump to the next page where I give you a bit of the perspective where our position is as of today. I mean, we as Allianz, we are deeply convinced that the insurance market needs a commonly accepted and independent curated data standard. We would and will definitely adopt this data standard as soon as it's widely spread in the market and it's demanded for. But what I would like to give you as an application in the real world is the perspective of a, say, globally spanned insurer, which grew over time, so which is a very heterogeneous organization. And from that point of view, has a pretty heterogeneous data landscape. And our first focus when we started that data journey many, many years ago, I have to say, was to first organize data in our shop before we can, say, go out and then also, say, entertain a globally accepted market standard. At that time when we started, and many of you will still remember that, the Accord initiative was still under its way. But it had its problems and did not make progress fast enough, at least for our taste. And therefore, we decided to establish an in-house data standard, following the lines of what was out there, of course. Nobody reinvents the wheel, as we all know. Today, after, say, a lot of work and sweat and tears, we have 30 entities which report regularly using our internal data standard, and we receive approximately 40 million locations per data delivery. We all store that in a central Catalyst data warehouse, which allows us to generate the required alternative data formats, because, of course, we in-house as well, we are using data in many aspects. We use it on different vendor models, and also for a number of applications around modeling, visualization, pure statistics, and accumulation control. And I think we do something which is very similar what was presented by Stuart. We use our in-house standard as the one and only, say, understood language, from which base we then translate our data in the other required data standards. And that, say, brings us into a very good position to also then, say, feed a data standard which is say, used in the market out there. With that, we have a well-controlled, well-understood and curated internal data standard. And this is something I would like to stress here. It was not an easy ride. So defining the fields and what we want to collect was, I would say, the easy part. But what was really difficult is the implementation work in-house, because we had to organize coaching sessions with each and every of the 30 entities, and sometimes multiple times, because we had changes in reporting lines while we were implementing the data standard. And we had to explain why we're doing that, how we're doing it, and how the data is to be understood. Because in the different markets we are operating, the understanding on the data elements or on how we describe our insured risks is not always the same. And therefore, to have a proper understanding of that can really not be underestimated. And by having our own understanding, we stay in control of how our data is being interpreted by the models, by broker, by vendors, and also by the reinsurers. And I can give you just a little glimpse on our Catalyst data warehouse on the next page. It consists of say, multiple elements. The core of that is the mapping table repository, where we translate all the local data standards, I would call it, into the global one. And in the same kind of way, we can, of course, also map to other data standards back and forth. And then we have the reporting, say the upload pane on the right-hand side, where the data is not only uploaded, but it's also validated, technically validated, so that all the delivered items are making sense. If we go to the next page, I would like to highlight a very important feature which helped us to improve data quality, because data quality, we all know, is really the basis of everything. You can also map rubbish into a data standard, but you have to make sure that, of course, this is not done. So data needs to be as good as possible. And this is an iterative process. What we learned in our process is if you give back a lot of information to the ones providing you data, the better the data quality gets. So we provide on the dynamic dashboards some mapping information, tabular information. We show the history over the past reporting periods, which allow then our counterparts in the entities to validate what they have delivered to us. And then if we go to the next page, derived from that, we can of course think about a lot of applications. We can monitor hotspots. We can provide drills into different data segments. All this can be done from one starting point onwards. But now I think you're rather interested in what our view on say, open data standards is, and that's summarized on the last page of my presentation. As I mentioned, it is for us key that there is an independent way of describing the insured risks in a common language. The data standard, and that was mentioned at the very start of this workshop, should be decoupled from the actual model or the model vendor, because only that way allows it to be, say, a central part where the model is not really twisted or calibrated to, and which allows then to compare the different, say, different views of alternative model providers. I also believe personally that the independence is important due to the fact that we should open the door for innovation. So it should not be in the hand of an individual vendor to say, oh, now I'm investing into say, the data for a new kind of feature in the model or a new kind of line of business we want to look at. I think that should all be transparent and open. New ideas should come to the table, and this is best possible in a setup where the standard is curated from an independent company. We as insurers and reinsurers, I think, want to maintain certain intellectual property. I think that's known, and that's also well respected. But there are many aspects which are actually not a secret. Yeah, we might want to pertain a certain intellectual property around how exactly we model, maybe using our own claims data, but when it comes to how we translate the results to business decision making, that might also be something which we want to keep for ourselves. But how we describe the risks, I think there is no secret around it. So in essence, there is no reason why we shouldn't collaborate around an open data standard and make, say, with our common knowledge, the best possible standard we can provide to our industry. And with that, I would give back the word to you, Jeremy. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for reminding us the importance of garbage in, garbage out, and how it's important to get the data absolutely right before we start modeling it. And next, to follow up on the same theme, we have Maximilian Strasser, who is Managing Director and Head of Model Development at Guy Carpenter's EMEA division, based in Munich. And Max has spent nearly 15 years with Guy Carpenter, and previously with reinsurance company Francona, now part of Swiss Re, and has a background in geophysics. So Max, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks, Sibylle. I hope you can also see my slide. Can you give
Absolutely,
me a
beautiful, yeah.
thumbs up? Excellent. Okay. Yeah, so I find it very interesting. So like what Sibylle was just saying, because I think you will see there are many points that we have in common, and I'm also really curious what Swiss Re will then say, and how that overlaps. I think I wanted also to kind of just say a few words to kind of motivate this whole thing. What Guy Carpenter has been doing in the area of Oasis, and then OED in particular. So I think it's fair to say that we've been using OED from probably the first day, because we've been quite active in the Oasis world also from very early stages. Actually, Guy Carpenter made a decision to incorporate the Oasis architecture as the model architecture that Guy Carpenter is going to use for their own model developments. We have therefore spent significant time and energy in different developments, such as disaggregation techniques, pre-processing tools in the early days to kind of compute K-tools, input formats that are pretty cryptic. We developed key server elements that are in-house now. We tested extensively the Oasis financial module, and then one day OED came up, and actually that made our lives much easier in many ways. So that was a good day for us, and ever since we've been using it. I mentioned pre-processing, and also maybe the more general term would be automation. So also there, I thought I'd start there, because I'll come to OED, but when we look at CAD model formats in general, and I've always been using CAD models and did sensitivity testing, and also try to do this in a programmatic way. You really face things that you like, and you face things that you don't like. And I just briefly wanted to bring those up. So the do's, as I call them, and these are not all of them, but here we already find some overlap to what Allianz was saying. We want a parallel agnostic format, actually a model agnostic format. I would totally agree on that. When it comes to parallels, we would also like a format that supports subparallels, and maybe also the combination of parallels. We would like the format to be as complete as possible, but flexible enough so that if something is really missing, or maybe we want to add cyber one day, like different lines, etc., we could. Nothing's stopping us. We want to make sure that the financial fields and the logic of those is completely fit for purpose, and we are not missing certain things. Even if, say, Oasis today, for instance, is not supporting everything that is there in the OED format, but we want to make sure that the format is future-proof, so to say. Then geography was also mentioned. We want to be flexible there, because I recently had a laugh with Eiste when we discussed Cresta, and we were saying, like, which Cresta? And we discovered that both NASDAQ and also Guy Carpenter refer to the former Cresta schemes as Cresta Old, and we have an abbreviation that is called CRO. So you need to be able to kind of implement these things when you deal with it. And then finally, we want something that we can read as a human being, but it has to be so consistent and complete that it can be machine processed. And the opposite, and unfortunately, this is the reality in certain older kind of model formats. I was thinking of the Accord Plus standard, actually, which was a massive, broad table, super comprehensive, could do everything, but it came with a wizard. And if you had like 3 columns of data and you wanted to populate it, you ran into the problem that you had to fill out this wizard for like 55 minutes. And there was just, no one would do that for simple data sets. And I think that was one of the reasons why I didn't succeed. Etc. Inconsistencies. We've been working with model codes and formats where for a parallel code, a number is used over here and a character is used over there, and that makes your life really hard when you try to script things. And then finally, admin levels, I already mentioned that. And we want to make sure that the thing is so complete that when you load it, all the software information is actually provided and you can basically work with API connections, etc. So that's that to set the stage. And the good news is really, so I have been working myself a lot recently with OED formats, and I digested it completely, and it's totally fit for purpose. And as I said before, you know, one major application in Carpenter is when we build our own models that are based in Oasis, and we do read OED formats. So as I said earlier, we greatly appreciated the, you know, when OED arrived, and you know, the availability of flexi fields and codes is really important to us, because that enabled the migration of our old models that are run on GCAT, our old platform, over, and we had no problems to kind of adjust the codes, etc. And we also had you know, a few user-defined columns that we now work with, and that's all working great. The pre-processing routines, again, they need to be very consistent and complete, and we want to make sure that, or the other way around, we are sure that they fully enable the automation. So that's really great. We've tested it, we've done it, and it works. And the other thing is that, you know, we don't need to do the accord thing where you know, we are loading 500 fields and like 490 are not populated. We can actually narrow it down to the just required fields and the conditionally required fields, which means that, you know, if you specify certain columns, that might require 2 other columns to also be populated, but that's all documented very nicely. By the way, documentation is also great for the OED. I think everybody who has a feeling for CAD models appreciates that. And one thing is, and that was mentioned by Matt, we are desperately awaiting the OED, and really looking forward to that for the same reasons. We really want to make sure that we kick off the automation there. Good. I've got a summary slide and this other chapter, so to say, which again overlaps a lot with what Allianz are doing, and to some degree also what was mentioned by Tej earlier. So as a reinsurance broker, we prepare tens of thousands of import files every year across multiple platforms, yeah, from many insurance companies. So we of course need to make sure that a central kind of format will be model agnostic, but we really appreciate, you know, that sort of format, because we can then build all sorts of tools on top of it. We also have done things in the past, but when I see what Allianz have been doing, that's certainly something we also have in mind in the near future, moving to new technologies like data lake, etc. And it's fair to say that we will base what we call universal file standard largely on OED. I think we are currently making that commitment because we already made the commitment on Oasis anyway. And as I said, it really works. It's really complete, and we like it a lot. So one thing I wanted to throw in the discussion is that we always say like, yeah, you know, we do this mapping table over here and then we're all good. The bitter truth is that many times it's not that simple. That I leave it there. It's really just a heads up, but it's more decision trees we're talking, and rules that need to be applied under certain circumstances. And the records have to be scanned for the situation of the record, and then decisions have to be made based on that. So it's not really a code-to-code mapping that we're talking here. So we are planning to move programmatically to, like, from an UFS. Once we standardize into a UFS, we then can generate any model import file we want for any given platform. And another thing I wanted to throw in the discussion, not supporting a full financial condition transformation is a shortcut. Yeah. So because that's the devil's in the detail, right? And that's really where problems come up. And I already mentioned that, you know, once you have done this mission, or you have successfully accomplished the mission of standardizing everything, and then having a process that converts from everywhere to everywhere, like again, Stuart has presented this, then Tash has presented this, and also Sibylle, and also we do the same thing. Yeah. So once you've done that, I think that opens doors that are beyond just CAD modeling. Yeah. So I think that's something where Guy Carpenter obviously has an interest, since the business model is slightly different from a reinsurer or an insurer. So that's my conclusion slide here. Really very positive experience with OED. I personally, and that's my personal view, not a Guy Carp view, but I fully agree that we want an industry standard. You know, it's overdue, and this is really would be a great start. I would not see any reason why we would not use it, rather than reinvent the wheel elsewhere again. And with the second request for an ORD, I give back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Max. And you've also probably given us the quote of the afternoon, which is we've tested it, we've used it, and it works. And that's very good to hear. So thank you very much indeed. And our final speaker this afternoon, I'm going to turn to Andreas Zbinden, who is a senior CAT model specialist. And he's in the R&D team of Swiss Re in their CAT perils department. He joined Swiss Re only recently, October 2018, and his role is to coordinate all business-related aspects around a proprietary CAT modeling platform within the group. Andreas, over to you.
Yep, thank you. Can you hear me and see my?
I can, and see your slides.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, very exciting event today. I see quite a lot of overlaps to what Max and Sibylle were talking about. Of course, also we have some specifics. Not sure, Jeremy, about the timing, how much time I have left, but
you've got time to do your presentation.
Excellent, excellent, thanks. So Swiss Re has been supporting Oasis since the very beginning. We have with Björn Eberhard, even a board member there with Oasis. We have hosted a number of Oasis conferences in Zurich. So we definitely see Oasis and also with that the open data standard as a key investment for Swiss Re for the future to enable interoperability in CAT modeling. I want to quickly give you an overview where we stand and why what we are actually doing and planning for. So Swiss Re has Swiss Re's view of risk is based on a own suite of catastrophe models, worldwide suite. We have a team of 45 plus CAT experts developing and maintaining these models. We have about 1,000 users, 1,000 plus users on our proprietary platform, working with our CAT models every day. It's all standardized, fully integrated with upstream, downstream systems. So we have a couple of user interfaces that connect to the application or to the platform. And so far with third-party models, we of course implement some interfaces to import exposure data or import and export result formats. But in general, they are used rather standalone basis. Where do we want to go? So we have two key aspects that we are currently working on, and we see OED and also ORD playing a key role. One is we have this build versus buy strategy where we say so far we build all our models ourselves, but there are some occasions where it might be more efficient to get an additional view from a third-party vendor, and Oasis is the way to do that for us. But as I mentioned before, everything very integrated. We want to avoid to have another tool, another format, etc. to use. So that's why we plan to, or what we actually currently actively working on integrating Oasis, and with that OED and ORD or future ORD in our platform. So a first version should be available over the next couple of months, and I'll show you a bit more graphical interpretation later on. At the same time, yeah, we cannot go out and say, oh, we need OED as an industry standard. We need to do something for it. So we also are working on implementing an import functionality for OED, export, of course. We use OED, maybe not as heavy as Max and Sibylle explained for their companies, but we have an Oasis set up, a standalone Oasis set up since it's actually not early 2019, it's more late 19. So for that, and where OED is used for model validation, etc. We are currently starting to work on an import interface so that by sometime 2021, we want to be able to digest OED data that comes from the market. And ORD, as previous speakers said, there's still quite a bit of work to do. So we are extremely closely following it, and also probably try to, or will work with the team there to make sure ORD becomes the standard for the market here. Next, here we go. So just quickly again, with a bit more color now. So we have this cat server platform it's called, where we have 3 components here. It's a central exposure data storage. So as with Allianz, for example, we have our own data standard. It exists for way before I joined, so probably 10 years or plus. So it's not something we can quickly replace by OED, but it's actually to have one standard that all the models work on, and one standard like OED as an input format. We end up with just one transformation, which makes life, of course, much simpler. That's certainly a big benefit with if OED would really become standard. We have multiple model kernels. So not just one model kernel, but like for legacy models, we have an older kernel, we have a state-of-the-art kernel, but 3 model kernels at the moment, and we have a central result data storage, so also kind of our own ORD already existing. We have a couple of interfaces, user interfaces, so everything is fully API enabled, so a number of main user interfaces. We have services for very specific applications. We even have some external clients calling our APIs for modeling services. We have central reporting. We have downstream systems for pricing, portfolio steering, closely integrated everything. And of course, yeah, we import exposure data from various formats. EDM, seed, etc. We have our internal formats, and we can export result data. So this cat server is our backbone. It's as mentioned, heavily integrated, and we have a whole variety of tools and systems consuming the cat services. Next. So, as I mentioned, integrate our third-party models seamlessly into our proprietary platform. The goal is that the user does not need to think about which model is being used. And we already have this experience with the multiple kernels. So simply said, what we need to do is add another kernel, then transform into OED. Oasis can consume it, produces, I called it ORD, it's not yet ORD, but yeah. And then we can feed it back into the central result data storage. For us, it's just another kernel. We are in the middle of the project at the moment. There are some challenges, as Max mentioned before, or it was mentioned before, for example, not all the structures that you can code in OED are consumed actually by the Oasis kernel. While the documentation for OED itself actually is really, really good. Must say that. Documentation, what actually Oasis is then consuming, there's still a bit of work to do, and we had some learnings there. But I think we have overcome these, and here as well, OED works very well for us. And it's important to have, as you can imagine, a kind of a stable or a standard here to make sure that we can continue using or adding additional models here. And we are very closely following, as I mentioned, what happens with ORD. We are at the moment also rethinking how this result format should look like in the future. If things work out perfectly, we could even think that ORD could become our standard result format as well. And what I mentioned as well, we want to enable the import of external data, exposure data, result data. And in an ideal world, there's one exposure data that is used to transfer data, that would be OED. And yeah, we're looking at what we saw from Aon. That's very promising. If Aon will be able to provide OED, that would simplify the whole exchange worldwide extremely. And similar on the ORD side, if we can consume one format and bring it into our platform, compare it with our models, etc., that's extremely useful. So increase and simplify the interoperability by providing interfaces for external OED and OED data. That's our second initiative that we are heavily working on. Brings it to my last slide. OED, very comprehensive already, as previous speaker said. Of course, we have to make sure we have a proper governance around it. We need to push all of us for wider usage in the community. A bit of work to be done in the documentation when working together with Oasis. ORD, we're closely following it. I think there was a very good work done by the Lloyd's Lab Cohort 3, and that needs to go on. And in the end, yeah, I think others have said it as well. ODS should not just be yet another standard provided by Oasis. ODS must become the standard owned and maintained by the industry. So it's a call to all of us. We are all in charge. We are explicitly looking at the brokers and vendors. They play a key role if they get it out, and also vendors provide OED as an exposure format. Then I think there's a great future ahead of us. Call for action, I called it up here. With that, back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you
Thanks
very much. Thank you very much indeed, Andreas. And I think we'd all say copy and paste for your call to action. That's exactly what we need. And thank you very much indeed for all of you attending today. We've probably reached the limit of attention span after 90 minutes. I want two things to say. Firstly, thank you to the organisers, Julia and Matt, for putting together a great show for this afternoon. But also, most important, thank you to the speakers and for all of you attending. We have had a series of very interesting but some quite technical questions. And as a result of that, what we plan to do is to answer all of those and make them available on our website in the coming days. Don't forget, there's a panel session coming up in November where we will have a more interactive section. And as soon as we've got the finalized dates, we'll let you know. But to everybody who's been involved in this afternoon, thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed it. And it's been a pleasure hosting for you this afternoon. Thank you all.